Taking the grids and the power companies and the transport systems into public ownership, because that way you take the profit motive out of it and can control things much better. Then we need to, they had a report done by a selection of experts called 30 by 2030, which is a plan for how we can minimise greenhouse gases as fast as possible. And that has 4 goals. The first one is to stop wasting energy. Something like 56% of energy wastage is from homes and industrial and commercial buildings. So we need to upgrade our buildings to the highest energy efficiency level possible. And all new buildings should be obviously built to the highest possible standard, zero carbon. In doing that, we'll also help to address fuel poverty, which obviously is a big issue here. Something like 60% of people in Orkney and Shetland are in fuel poverty, so that's quite high. Goal 2 is to decarbonise heat. So currently we have quite a lot of people, certainly in Orkney and Shetland, who are still working on oil, coal, other solid fuels. And we need to decarbonise heat and move towards renewable and electricity-based heat. Goal 3, decarbonise electricity. So that means encouraging renewables and bringing back all the things that have been removed by the Tory government. Increasing onshore and offshore wind, working on our marine energy, and I think I've just had my 2 minutes, have I not?
You've got well done. Thank you very much.
Orkney Islands Council's obviously declared a climate emergency, but as a community we need to get together and define, a detailed plan of action for what our emergency response is going to be. So I was excited not that long ago to be part of a planning meeting for a Sustainable Orkney conference. It's going to be held in March 2020, and that's going to allow folk across across all sectors of the economy in Orkney to take stock and plan, what is going to be the transition to a net zero economy. And with that in mind, it was good to see Nicola Sturgeon earlier on in the campaign, and then it's backed up in the manifesto, announcing this green energy deal. Because we need to push this on as hard as we can and take the rest of the UK with us. So with that in mind, the SNP MPs, when we get down there, would be demanding the UK accelerates its action to meet Scotland's climate change targets, because they're the toughest legal targets in the world. 75% reduction in emissions by 2035 and net zero emissions no later than 2040, and then net zero of all emissions by 2045. We'll also campaign for the UK government to bring forward plans to move to electric vehicles to match the Scottish target of 2032, and also for accelerated deployment of fully operational carbon capture, utilisation and storage facilities to ensure Scotland isn't denied that opportunity again. And among that too is a commitment to trying to push the timetable for these island connectors that we're still waiting for, which to me mind, and I guess I would get a lot of opposition here, that we're being socially and economically damaged at the moment by their lack of being, basically.
Okay.
According to the Conservative Party, under the Conservatives, the United Kingdom is leading on combating climate change. We work to secure the Paris Agreement, an important deal to limit global temperatures rises and help avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And we're making the UK the first major economy to commit to ending its contribution to global warming. Our net zero pledge commits the UK to net zero emissions by 2050, meaning emissions from homes, transport and industry will be hugely reduced, with remaining emissions offset by planting trees or using carbon capture technology. Lawrence Tubiana, the architect of the Paris Agreement, called this a historic commitment that will reverberate right around the world. and all eyes now turn to the rest of the EU to match this pledge. And in Scotland, the Scottish Conservative 2017 Global Challenge Local Leadership Climate Change Position Paper sets out a number of measures in areas involved to Scotland, including creating 150,000 new hectares of woodland per year, commitment to restoring degraded peatland, which will help protect against flooding and act as a natural carbon sink, source at least 50% of Scotland's energy from renewables by 2030, and develop the regulatory framework required to finance solutions to support growth of district heat networks.
Okay. There is about a climate change legislation. Lots of countries in the world, well not lots, but several countries in the world have introduced climate change legislation, like Ireland, like Denmark, like Scotland. And so I guess the key question from Annie is, do you think the legislation passed thus far here in Scotland is good enough, is tough enough, is fast enough? So let's start with you this time, Robert, rather than Coilla.
Well, I guess, well, at the moment, it's, as far as I understand it, it's as far as Scotland can go within the confines of how the UK energy policy and energy transformation is working, and a lot of that's to do with the gas grid. You know, there's a lot of questions around what's going to replace the gas that's in that grid at the moment, and we need to wait. I mean, I think the Committee on Climate Change were quite clear that the targets that Scotland were setting were kind of had to be in line with, well, you know, realistic change that could happen in that way. And you always hear a bit of murmurings about the gas lobby might be, you know, quite strong, and you know, a change to the makeup of what's going into the gas grid and heating. A lot of homes that are lucky to have gas heating and light ourselves up here, that mix might change just as quickly as we would want it to.
Okay, thank you. Coilla?
No, it's not fast enough.
That's it.
Well, no, it's not fast enough, is it?
No, it's not.
It doesn't come anywhere near what the IPCC say we need. So yeah, we need to do something about that. And I'd say getting rid of a Conservative government that is determined not to do anything about it is the first step.
Okay. Ms. Annie, do you want to come back on this one, or you quite happy with it? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so part and parcel of this climate change emergency is not just actually the carbon emissions and the timescales and so on and so forth, but it's also loss of biodiversity. Mm-hmm. And I have a question here, an anonymous question, but perhaps from one of the RSPB contingents in the room, I don't know. How will your party set out to halt the biodiversity loss currently being caused by climate change, the effects of which are already being seen in Orkney? And it's something that classically governments don't pay that much attention to, but there have been major reports recently on the scale of biodiversity loss, which is appalling, and so I would like to think that our political parties have got some kind of plans to rectify this. Coilla?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we need to have more sustainable agriculture, so altering the way that the subsidies work for agriculture such that they are dependent on more sustainable methods. That will help with more land-based things. When it comes to biodiversity of bird life and sea life, they're kind of interdependent often. And I think that's going to mean we really have to attack the targets aggressively, because when you're losing things like sand hills because of the temperature of the water, there's not much that you can do about that unless you actually attack the underlying cause. And you know, if the sand eels aren't there for the puffins and etc., then you have to actually deal with the whole thing. Mm-hmm. I would say.
So more holistic.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When I was up in Shetland, I spoke to somebody that's employed only part-time through funding for SNH, that's looking at things like peatland restoration, and she was talking about the amount that these areas can hold in the way of carbon sequestration, and that's obviously one area that's a government agency that's backing that up, and certainly through agriculture, which is the key sector. That's what I would call the beating heart of Orkney's economy. I sat through NFU meetings in the 1990s when funding streams were changing for farmers, and they were holding themselves up as custodians of the countryside. And when I was at the hustings the other week with them, I was urging them to grasp that moniker, because I think they feel that they've had an unfair crack of the whip over some of the BBC output and beef production in recent weeks, and they could really lead the way in showing that they are going to be these custodians of our countryside, whether that's the farmland that they're actively using, or the areas of the hill land that they don't, and we've got obviously issues around the stoats and geese, which I've written about for the Orkney farmer, and they really need to stand up on that one and ensure that if they are going to be custodians of the countryside, that they act to ensure that our wildlife isn't destroyed by this, this incomer that doesn't have a predator, because it's not just the biodiversity that's being affected there, but it's the potential income for wildlife tourism and the wider economy. So there's lots of ways that I think the Scottish Government can support our farmers in becoming more environmentally friendly when it comes to that.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, Liam.
Apologies for being late.
That's all right. I'm going to give you a few seconds. We've asked Coilla and Robert to give a 2-minute summary of what their particular party will be doing come the election for the climate emergency. So if you would do that for us in a couple of minutes' time, that would be helpful.
Yep.
And we're going to move on. That was such a neat link, you two, because I've got a couple of questions on agriculture. And agriculture, clearly in Orkney, is a desperately important sector. It's desperately important to our economy, and it's desperately important for, as you both have said in different ways, the impact of agriculture on biodiversity in particular. So I've got a couple of questions here. I've got one from Leslie. Where's Leslie? Where's Leslie? There's Leslie. And I've also got one from Janine. Janine, there, so we're both roughly in the same place. So they're both saying, what plans have you as parties to help farmers change to more climate-friendly practices and to support them? You've hinted about that already. And then the question is, in a wee bit more details, what kind of changes, what kind of changes to reverse climate emissions are achievable through altering farming techniques? And Janine quotes the Australian government, which she can perhaps amplify later once you've answered the questions. But I'm a farmer, small farmer, and I know that there are very obvious prescriptions that could be done by every single farmer in Orkney, which would have an immediate impact on the carbon emissions of that particular sector. And if you look at the sectors that we need to tackle in Orkney, transport is the big one, housing is another big one, and agriculture. Those are the 3 big sectors that we need to tackle. So, agriculture, prescriptions, change. Well,
as I said, I think it starts off with changing the subsidies so that using sustainable methods is encouraged. So it makes the subsidies kind of dependent upon the methods being used in order to encourage that. Then I think one can also help farmers by bringing back the encouragement to generate renewable energy. So a lot of farmers had put up wind turbines and then discovered that those turbines were no longer encouraged by government. In fact, they were positively discouraged in some parts. So if you allow, if you encourage farmers again and other people to generate their own renewable energy, then from that they can use that to power their farms and also sell any excess into the grid. Yeah. So having done that, you then have the possibility of encouraging them to use electric equipment rather than fossil fuel powered equipment, because then they can be generating their own power for their own equipment. And there is a tractor, it's either out or it's about to be out next year from John Deere. So that's a first step. And then from a point of view of methods, well, obviously I'm afraid our farmers were rather wedded to what they call manure, which obviously isn't manure. And it would be a lot better if it was manure, really. And trying to get them away from that, because there are a lot of other things that you can do, but none of them are as immediate. So what I've seen with farmers is that they are any farmers here. So I'm about to be in trouble probably.
There's one.
But you know, you spread your manure, your fertilizer on your pasture, and you get an immediate growth, and that they like that. But you put clover or you spread slurry, and it's not so immediate. So it is a matter of encouragement, really, to stop doing the manure and move over to the other methods. And I think there's other things that can be done as well, and I'm not a farming expert, I have to admit.
Thank you.
Yeah, when I was at the, I'll refer back there in a few hustings again, but the one thing I flagged up was that when the Orkney-wide energy audit was carried out in 2014, and I understand that's being updated now, there were various switching options that were being put forward to increase electricity demand in the country, and there was a variety of these that pertain particularly to agriculture, and these included heated growing spaces, crop drying, heated anaerobic digesters, ammonia as a fuel, fertiliser production, and so on. And another idea that maybe didn't make it into that was even creating an insect farm with the end product being added to cattle feed as a protein boost. So these are the things, you know, like obviously the Scottish Government wants to see funding directed to active farmers, and there are farmers have been doing a bit of writing for the Orkney farmer recently, and a lot of there's been a couple of articles specifically on grazing research and you know, the different types of rotational grazing, and I think pastures for life's another one. So that, you know, there are farmers out there that are trying to make their units as efficient as possible in the face of you know, rising costs and decreasing prices. So I would be all for directing, you know, the funding to these younger and also young farmers maybe that are doing that kind of work. And when I was up in Shetland, I was past Bigton Farm and spoke to Amy Budge, who's running along with her sister the Shetland Monitor Farm, and that comes to an end next March. But she's keen to, you know, keep that group going, because the community's come together and been very supportive again, and that's it. That's the kind of moves that you want to see, because it decreases the sort of isolation that maybe sometimes farmers feel when they're working on their own. And if you know, if funding like that can be used to bring folk together and to share ideas about how they're going to decrease their, you know, their carbon footprint at the same time as increasing their productivity, that can only be good, because I think we've got really quite ambitious targets being set for the food and drink sector in terms of increased you know, turnover at the same time as they're going to have to reduce, you know, their carbon footprint. So yeah, it's challenges in a short time.
Okay, thank you. So Liam, have you recovered your...
Indeed. Apologies firstly for being slightly late. I was holding a surgery in Kirkwall, so and I wasn't finished up till 5:45. So if I got here on time, there have been questions asked about me adhering to local speed limits. I mean, I think some of the points that Coilla and John and Robert have just made, I would have no difficulty with at all. I think Robert's highlighted a number of ways in which, look, there are, depending on how you're operating as a farm unit at the moment, there'll be some options that are more relevant to you than others. But I think the other point to stress in that is that you can make an argument about the bottom line as well. I think the misconception that is also that is often I think perpetuated is that this move to more sustainable types of farming, it automatically is going to make you less profitable. The revenue that you get in is going to inevitably be diminished, and I think that needs to be debunked. That's not to say that this process will not be difficult, and getting people to change their behaviours is not straightforward. But I think debunking the myth that somehow this is going to strike at the profitability of the farming units, either here in Orkney or in other parts of the country, I think is part of that process of winning hearts and minds. I think one of the points that maybe wasn't picked up by others is the need to have a far tighter grip in terms of nitrogen budgeting and auditing. I think until now we've kind of skirted around that. It's been done on a voluntary basis. I think increasingly we're going to have to see that move to a more statutory footing and limits applied to it. But I think likewise the targets we are setting are net targets. I think there are going to be sectors which will be able to make overall reductions in terms of their emissions that take them sort of below zero, that they provide a positive contribution in terms of hitting the targets that we've set for 2045. I think there's elements of the farming sector that by their very nature are going to have emissions attached to them. There's not a means at the moment, and things may change over the next 10, 15, 20 years, whereby you could see those emissions being entirely avoidable. But nevertheless, I think that speaks to the point that I think was being raised as I came in, that we also need to be clear about what is the net picture in terms of farming. Are those that are managing the land getting credit for the things that are doing in a positive sense, whether through pasture, grazing, or indeed forestry or whatever it is that they're using the land for, as well as being held to account for the emissions that are being created through the type of farming that they're doing. So I think unless you have a clear picture about what is actually happening, the contribution, both positive and negative, that individual farmers in the sector is making as a whole, there's a risk that you then start making decisions, either at a UK level or at a Scottish level, that it will be difficult to sell to people because their view of the contribution they're making is out of sync with what they're being asked to do.
Okay, thank you all. I mean, there's a fair degree of unanimity there. So there's a couple of questions. One rather general. These are anonymous questions, so I have no idea who to go to for help. But the first is, with renewable energy forming such an integral part of our solution, how do you plan to support the renewable energy here in Orkney? Which I think is the general question to you all. Sorry, Liam, I'm going to come back to you shortly, honestly. And the second question is, what action will you take to make use of the surplus renewable energy here in Orkney? So there's two questions there. There's one general, how are we going to support the renewable energy industry? And the second is more specific, how are we going to use the surplus energy here in Orkney? Okay, so you've got a couple of minutes to think about that, because Liam, I'm now going to ask you to summarise for us, if you will, the policy.
I'll touch on some of that inevitably, but try and leave more of the detail to a separate response. I mean, I think part of the challenge with this, and I've noticed this in terms of the debate that we've had in the Scottish Parliament, particularly over the last year, 18 months or so, is that the declaration of a climate emergency, which is now pretty well accepted across the piece in a political sense. Doesn't seem to chime particularly well then with discussions around just transitions. There seems to be a discordance between those two words, and yet I think, being realistic, a transition is what we're going to need to see. Net zero by 2045 is a challenging target. It is at the edges of what the UK Climate Change Committee on Climate Change has said is deliverable in a Scottish context, albeit that I think the view across the piece in the Scottish Parliament was that that is the absolute latest, and one of the most interesting debates, I think, was around the interim target for 2030, where fortunately we managed to push the Scottish Government into adopting a target of 75% by 2030, recognising that if we're not on the right trajectory by then, whatever we set for 2045 is almost irrelevant. I think in terms of energy production, energy generation, we've made good progress. Scottish Liberal Democrats were part of the government that set the earliest targets back in the early 2000s. At the time, they were dismissed as helplessly over-ambitious and undeliverable. Needless to say, they were achieved ahead of time and by some margin. And I think credit to the current Scottish Government, once there was a change of administration, that trajectory has been continued. That's not to say there isn't more to be done, but I think the story in terms of energy has been pretty impressive so far. Leaving transport and heat as the two areas where there's been next to no progress made at all. I think in terms of heat, what we're proposing is a radically more ambitious approach to insulation of homes and other buildings over the course of the next 10 years, prioritising low-income households over the next 5 years. And in terms of transport, I think Orkney obviously leads the way in terms of take-up of electric vehicles, but we are woefully behind the curve in terms of where we need to be. We've seen figures today suggesting that the sale of SUVs outstrip EVs by 37 to 1. So in terms of changing behaviour and changing practice, we are nowhere near where we need to be. We need to get the incentives into that sort of transfer. We need to get the infrastructure in place that supports it. And in terms of heavier use vehicles, the technology there looks more likely to be hydrogen-based rather than EVs. And again, I think the figures compared to some of our European partners show that we are still in the slow lane. So I think finding the incentives, as well as I suppose the stick of ensuring that there are no petrol diesel vehicles being sold new onto the market from 2030 is the only way of making that transition in the time frame we need to make it.
Thank you very much, Liam. Now we're on to the renewable sector. So we have the general question: how are we going to support renewable energy in Orkney? And the particular question about how are we going to use our surplus energy here in Orkney. So let's go with you, Robert, first this time.
I think I maybe alluded to that earlier on with the Nicola Sturgeon's announcement of this green energy deal that aims to ensure, the longer term certainty that renewable schemes really need to support investment. And I don't think it's any secret when I've been gathering Orkney and Shetland that the biggest bugbear is this lack of interconnector coming forward for both sets of islands, because at the moment I learned very quickly that Shetland are just a stage behind Orkney, because we had our grid full to bursting by 2012, and we went through a painful process of sitting in a grid steering group with various bodies, and the end result of that was more or less frustration, because the answers that we were looking for, the solutions that we'd found as a local community were kind of knocked back by the privatised utility and others round the table.
So who do you actually think is to blame? We've been trying for 10, 15 years to get these interconnected. What's going wrong? Why can't?
Well, I mean, it's all reserved to the UK. It's a Westminster issue, and when the National Grid came here, and when I think it was post-referendum anyway, National Grid representatives came to Orkney, and they admitted at that stage that they were funding a link for Ayrshire down to Merseyside, the Western Link. They were part funding that along with Scottish Power, and when we questioned them about that, why weren't we getting our connection, because it had been, it was still away over the horizon. I framed the question in the way that I said, if Alistair Carmichael, having got the biggest no vote in the UK, in Orkney and Shetland, if the Tories had wanted to reward him because he was part of that coalition by just saying to National Grid, give Orkney that cable, doesn't matter about the business case, he's been a good boy, just give them that. Mm-hmm. And they said they were kind of taken aback because they'd never had that scenario. They said, yeah, if the government told them that they had to put that cable in, they would have to. Okay. So the will would be there. I mean, Alistair was Secretary of State for Scotland when Ed Davey, this Lib Dem colleague, was Energy Secretary, and we had no action then. So I think we really need to be getting that energy policy overhauled or back into the Scottish hands so that we can progress with it.
Thank you. Can I link to Coilla then? So nationalise the lot, is that the solution?
Well, certainly nationalise the grid and nationalise the supply arms of the power companies. By nationalising the grid, that means that the grid is designed such that it delivers energy outwards. It doesn't really take it inwards. So it goes from large cables down to smaller and smaller. So it really needs to be completely modernised in order to deal with power coming from the outlying areas inwards, as it does with renewable energy, because it's more diffuse. And also taking the grid into public ownership means that you remove the commercial pressure on interconnectors. So the reason we can't get an interconnector is that the companies want there to be large farms in order to make money, so that the grid is worthwhile, so that the interconnector is worthwhile for them to put in. Yeah. So if you remove that, then what happens is the government can just say, we're going to put that interconnector in, and then Orkney and Shetland can decide how they're going to use that, what kind of renewable energy they want to have, how they want it to be. So it doesn't have to be an enormous wind farm like Viking in peatland over a vast area. It can be more like Orkney. In fact, when I was in Shetland, I was speaking to some people who just recently visited Orkney, and they were saying, why can't we have our renewable energy like Orkney has it, where you see, there's turbines, a few here, a few there, there's not this large concentration. It's more diffuse. And also, it means that we can encourage community energy and energy on farms, so that the benefit from that energy comes back into the community rather than going off into a commercial large energy company. And that obviously deals with what do we do with the surplus? We export it via the interconnector that we now have.
Okay, thank you. Now, Liam, it's a bit unfair to ask you why you as surrogate Alistair Carmichael didn't secure a cable for us, so we'll keep with the generalities.
No, I'm happy to respond to that. I mean, I think I find it passing strange that Robert's response to this, and indeed the SNP's response to this, is more centralisation and more micromanagement. I think there have been serious questions asked were a cable simply gifted on the basis of somehow a constituency voting the right way. I think that speaks volumes about the mentality within the SNP, and maybe goes some way to explaining why we're still without RET. But I think in relation to the National Grid, I think there's absolutely no doubt, both with National Grid and Ofgem, that whether or not that regulated model is right, actually the parameters you set, the objectives you set for both of those organisations is key. So if you elevate cost to consumer above longer term objectives, whether it's in terms of sustainability, whether it's in terms of a more diverse energy market, then you would expect producers at all levels to respond to that. At the moment, the cost to consumer is absolutely key to Ofgem. As somebody who's represented a constituency that sat rather unproudly at the top of fuel poverty league tables for year after year, I don't think we can be blind to the importance of that. But nevertheless, I think the signals that successive administrations have given both the National Grid and Ofgem haven't helped. I think again, Orkney is leading the way. I mean, it's adversity is often the mother of innovation. If I've not butchered that saying too badly. And what we're seeing emerging through the grid constraints that we've seen in Orkney is the sort of innovation for which I think we are rightly renowned, and is going to unlock some of the problems that we face in terms of managing energy as a whole. I think the Reflex project is enormously exciting, is not really well understood, probably even within Orkney, and Firth of Orkney even less so. I think what we're seeing in terms of hydrogen ferry development and whatnot is leading the way. That's not to say that, given the potential we have, that we will not want to export, either through interconnectors or through some other mechanism. And I think it's finding the way of making sure that we give a route to market for that innovation, so that it's not choked off at a stage where it is unreasonable to expect it to be cost competitive with technologies that are far more well advanced and far mature.
Okay.
Centralisation, which was something that the Lib Dems saw I was going about, but
with
the Scottish government are decentralising as much as they can, and like we've already got a local heat and energy efficiency strategy being worked on by some local authority. And the latest one is a local energy policy statement, which sets out the approach that the Scottish Government wants to see embedded in practice and behaviours of all stakeholders. You know, when our energy systems becoming increasingly decentralised, and that's where UK policy fails, because they're reacting far too slowly to decentralised generation. Orkney's right at the forefront of this. I mean, I think we can be a model for that, because we had to innovate. I remember sitting in this room when Mark Hull talked about, that was at the launch of Laura Watt's book, Energy at the End of the World, where he said that, you know, the innovative ideas came out of fear for their communities, and that's why we're pushing that, and that's why the Scottish Government will always back a local plan as opposed to something that's being imposed on us. In Shetland, they tried to get me to say that I was supportive of Viking energy because I wanted to see an interconnector, but clearly you have to divorce that. It's the regulations that are coming from the UK that are forcing communities to come up with these huge plans. It's not necessary at all. We should be making plans that suit our needs, suit our resources, and the cables should be coming regardless. Ireland are having an interconnector part funded by the EU, you know, to go to the continent, and you know, we're in danger of missing out on that if we get pulled out of Europe against our will. We're definitely not centralising as a Scottish government.
I need to move on. You can carry on this discussion after. I can't believe that we've had 47 minutes without anybody mentioning Europe. That is extraordinary. I know, that's it. I'm going to move on again. I've just discovered a nugget of a question in here, which is right at the heart of the matter. It's all about this climate emergency that we're here to discuss, and it's about targets and is it achievable. So we've got a UK government target of 2050, we've got a Scottish government target of 2045. Extinction Rebellion Orkney and Extinction Rebellion I know would like that target brought way forward to 2030 or even 2025. So when is an emergency a real emergency, and how are you going to deliver in an emergency timescale with something as pressing as this? So we'll start with you this time, Liam.
Okay. I mean, I think I tried to address that in my earlier remarks about the language we use, and I quite understand why, in response to the declaration of an emergency, transition seems to lack some of the urgency one might expect. But I think what we tried to do in framing legislation is to work with the evidential base that we have. I think our legislation has been seen as ground leading. The Scottish Government will claim it's their legislation. I would argue that it's the Scottish Parliament's legislation, and one of its strengths has been the fact that it was unanimously passed first time round. The most recent legislation had the abstention of the Greens. I understand at one level why that was the case, but I think one of its strengths is the political will, and I think what we're going to require of people in terms of the changes we want to see. It is only helpful that we have that broad coalition of support. As you say, the UKCCC recommended 2050 at a UK level. Lib Dems are pressing for 2045. The legislation in the Scottish Parliament passed earlier this year is 2045 for net zero, but an interim target of 75%. The Scottish Government have been proposing 70%. The Greens have been proposing 80%. I think it's relatively, the passing legislation is the easy bit, the delivering of it the very hard bit. I think it's also seductive to get drawn into a bit of a kind of Dutch auction in reverse, where you're bringing the deadline down just for the sake of outmanoeuvring your political opponents. I think we need to be careful here, because what we're asking people to do is going to be significantly challenging. It's going to rest on some technologies that are yet to either be proven, and therefore I think that the 2030 target that I know the Greens have gone into this election proposing for net zero is a bit of an about turn on what they were arguing during the course of the passage of this legislation.
You're not going to get a rise out of the Green Party chair, because I need to move on to Coilla and then Robert. We can carry that on.
Probing your neutrality.
Well, the 30 by 2030 report that I was referring to earlier says that we need to act fast, and it's looking to delivering 77% reduction in energy emissions by 2030 compared to 2010. And it also says that that's the top edge of what is actually possible with the technology we have at the moment, and that we need to be continually learning and assessing how we're doing and taking on board that as we go forward. So as we go forward and the technology improves, we need to move faster and faster.
Hasn't been much evidence of that to date, but nevertheless, Robert?
Yeah.
No, there hasn't, that's right, but it needs to change, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
I'm sure, well, like I've already said, that the pace of change will have to quicken, but we must make sure, and I'm really glad that the Scottish Government has taken recognition of the fact that cuts, changes can have impacts across whole communities, and the principles of just transition are something that are going to be very important in this, and I'm glad that they have set up this Just Transition Commission under Professor Jim Skee, who's already been done across Scotland, looking at how communities are faring with the transition to a low carbon economy. And I've already suggested that when we have this conference in March, that they are involved in some way, shape or form in that. I mean, it's really important, obviously, that Orkney sets its baseline, and we've talked about, this is going to be across all sectors, because Coilla did mention the decarbonisation of electricity. Well, we've already done it, and I said to the SNP conference in 2015, basically the rest of Scotland, you just catch up when you really feel the need to, and hopefully they feel the need to know, because where decarbonised electricity is not being officially recognised, and it's harmful to this community in terms of fuel poverty because of the need to meet building regulations by putting supposed low carbon heating solutions in, and to coin a phrase for the Norrie Kerr, the boss at Energy Action Scotland, low carbon heating doesn't equate to wiping out fuel poverty. We need to be really careful that the changes that we make do not impact adversely on folk that are living in communities like this where we don't have access to mains gas, because coupled with the austerity regime for the Tories, the lack of mains gas, and the inability of UK energy regulation to be fit into this community. We're paying more for our electricity, we've got longer heating seasons and so on, so the change must take everybody with them. Nobody should be left behind, because it's an absolute sin that folk in Orkney, where we have all this plentiful renewable energy, are having to choose between heating and eating, and food bank use is growing, and universal credit doesn't help where folk are being kicked when they're doing, basically. So all these things we need to take cognizance of when we're talking about shifting targets quicker.
Thank you. Now, believe it or not, people, we've had 55 minutes already, and we need to be out of here in 5 minutes. So there's 2 or 3 really interesting questions left here. Perhaps we should have had more time. So I'm now going to move on to ask the candidates. We'll start with Liam this time and go in this order. Just to summarise, 2 or 3 nuggets, what it is about this climate emergency. Why should people in this room vote Scottish Liberal Democrats, SNP or Scottish Labour? And whilst doing so, can you please tell us what your personal commitment is? What are you going to change in your lifestyle to help contribute to lessening carbon emissions?
Right, so I'll maybe start with that. We've made the transition from a diesel vehicle to a hybrid. I was out visiting Jonathan Porterfield at Eco Cars yesterday, and he observed that I was transitioning.
Yes,
so
good.
I've yet to make the full transition.
But not fast enough.
But not fast enough, as I know you have been chastising me for some time. Actually, reducing the use of the vehicle completely is probably as much of a factor. I think there's limits to what I can do in terms of my carbon footprint in flying to Edinburgh. I think practicalities of taking a ferry and a train or whatever down to Edinburgh with the parliamentary timetable isn't great, but there's use of other technologies that mean you don't necessarily need to be physical.
And 2 or 3 nuggets, why should people vote Scottish Liberal Democrat?
Well, I think our track record in terms of the environment, whether it be renewables or the other targets we set in climate change, have been in government, have been leading. I think Ed Davies' role as energy secretary.
Someone asked, why did you support the renewable subsidies to renewables?
It's almost as if I teed you up, because I didn't, and nor did Ed Davey, and nor did the Liberal Democrats. The cuts to renewable subsidies came in once the Tories were left administering the place on their own. So we may have taken a hit for it, but actually some of what we were saying about acting as a restraining factor on the worst instincts of the Conservatives certainly has come to pass in 2015. I think what you've got in the Lib Dem manifesto is one that sets out some ambitious targets, whereas if you look at the independent assessments of deliverability, and ultimately that's what it's about. I mean, I think your manifesto can say whatever the hell you want it to say, but if it's not credible, if what you're bringing in by way of taxation it doesn't square with what you're proposing to spend, then frankly it all becomes a bit of an academic exercise. And I think what the Lib Dems have put forward in this manifesto is one that puts the climate at the centre of it, but puts it forward in a way that suggests it is going to be deliverable within the 2045.
Okay. So good track record must be deliverable. And Robert, what's your SNP going to do for us quickly, and what are you going to do as an individual?
Well, I think I've outlined quite a lot of what the SNP...
Yeah, let's just stick with you as an individual then.
Yeah, well, going back the way, I'd like to think that I've got a bit of credentials because of me. The role that I've played, I took in money for a climate challenge fund project in Orkney in 2011, which it looked at energy efficiency and growing projects and transport, but it led to the creation of this community garden, and we were able to give money for the polytunnels, the polytunnel there, and for the wood that marked off the plots, and for basically the equipment. And OHAL, I managed to persuade them to lease the land to that group. So we also had the Orkney Community Empowerment Project in partnership with the James Sutton Institute that looked into reducing folks' carbon footprints. And I think Lartley found that folk that are living in social electric houses probably have among the smallest carbon footprints around anyway. But we helped a lot of folk in their energy saving in that respect. And more recently, I'm still waiting for. I'm waiting for 3 charging points to be installed so that the first zero emissions car club in Orkney can get underway. It's been a frustrating experience, and it shows that Transport Scotland are not perfect, because I've told them to learn lessons for the clunky way that their charging points come in. So I was thinking with Liam talking about infrastructure earlier.
We've all been there.
I don't need lessons on that.
Yeah, Coilla, sadly you've got 1 minute. Couple of nugget points about Labour and what are you doing as an individual?
As an individual, I have an electric car. I buy green and renewable energy. I have air source heat pumps. I buy organic food. I buy fair trade and ethical clothing. From a Labour point of view, I honestly believe, and I wouldn't be standing for Labour if I didn't, that Labour is the party that are actually going to tackle this. It's very important to me, and I've been involved with dealing with some of the policy making, and I honestly truly believe they're going to do this, and what they're intending to do is tackle the climate emergency whilst simultaneously dealing with the amount of inequality we have and the poverty, and creating new jobs, stimulating the economy, and getting an economic multiplier effect. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, we've just not quite made that 1901, but can I ask you, in the time-honoured fashion, to thank Coilla, to thank Robert, and to thank Liam for coming up.